A kitchen table. Somewhere in rural Mississippi. A mason jar sits in the July heat, its contents dark and thick. Fermented chicken liver, garlic salt, and rendered fat, left to ripen for 3 days in the southern sun. The smell alone could clear a room. But for a catfisherman working the oxbow lakes of the Yazoo Delta, this jar held something no tackle shop could sell him. A family recipe passed down across 4 generations, each one swearing it was the only bait worth baiting a trotline with. Long before the American fishing tackle market grew into the nearly $9 billion industry it is today, American fishermen relied on something far simpler. Not the engineered polymers and laser-honed hooks lining the walls of modern sporting goods stores, but knowledge, practical, regional, deeply personal knowledge built from the land and water around them. For most of American history, fishing was not a sport. It was survival. And the baits that brought fish to the hook were not purchased. They were made, in kitchens and barns, on creek banks and back porches, from ingredients as common as cornmeal and as pungent as rotting shad. These preparations were not written down in catalogs. They lived in the hands and memories of the men and women who used them, transmitted the way most essential knowledge traveled in rural America, from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, generation to generation. This is not a recipe video. This is the story of a knowledge system, one that sustained American fishing communities for centuries, and what its slow disappearance reveals about the changing relationship between anglers and the waters they fish. From the Mississippi Basin to the Gulf Coast, from the Appalachian headwaters to the coastal rivers of the Carolinas and Texas, homemade bait culture was once the beating heart of American fishing. And while much of it has faded, it has not entirely gone. Hello my friends, welcome to American Fishing Atlas. Subscribe to the channel, share and like. Thank you. The practice of preparing bait from natural materials is as old as fishing itself on this continent. Long before European settlement, Native American peoples across the eastern woodlands and the Mississippi Valley employed an extraordinary range of techniques to attract and capture fish. The Cherokee of the southern Appalachians used crushed buckeye nuts to stun trout in mountain streams, a botanical knowledge refined over thousands of years. Tribes along the Great Lakes fashioned lures from bone and copper, baited traps with animal entrails, and even washed nets in sumac leaf solutions to eliminate human scent. These were not crude methods. They were precise, ecologically attuned systems of harvesting, the original American bait science. European settlers, who arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries, brought their own bait traditions, but the American landscape demanded adaptation. In the rivers and lakes of the interior, waters vastly different from the chalk streams of England, colonists learned quickly that local knowledge mattered more than imported technique. By the early 1800s, a distinctly American approach to bait preparation had taken shape, driven by the species available, the ingredients at hand, and the practical ingenuity of people who fished not for leisure, but for food. The traditions that developed were as varied as the geography itself. Along the Mississippi River and its vast network of tributaries, a drainage basin spanning 31 states, catfish were king. And catfish, with their extraordinary sense of smell, demanded extraordinary bait. The channel catfish alone possesses roughly 140 specialized folds in its nasal membranes, enabling it to detect chemical compounds at concentrations as low as 1 part per 100 million. This biological fact shaped an entire culture of bait-making. If a catfish could smell it from a quarter-mile away, it was worth fermenting. In the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, families developed what might be called stink bait traditions, preparations based on fermented animal products, blood, cheese, and rendered fats, designed to produce the maximum possible scent trail in warm, slow-moving water. Along the Gulf Coast, commercial catfishermen working the bayous and oxbow lakes of Louisiana baited their trotlines with preparations made from chicken liver cured in garlic salt, left to cure and toughen until the bait could survive hours underwater without dissolving. In the Ozarks, fishermen dug what they called sandworms and green worms from the riverbanks, creatures with a naturally pungent odor that channel catfish found irresistible in the heat of summer. Further east, in the mountain streams of Appalachia, the traditions were different but no less sophisticated. Brook trout and smallmouth bass required subtlety, not stench. Appalachian anglers developed dough baits from flour, cornmeal, and honey, simple mixtures that could be shaped onto a hook and dropped into cold mountain pools. Some added anise oil. Others swore by a pinch of vanilla. The recipes varied from hollow to hollow, each family guarding its particular formula with the seriousness of a trade secret. It is worth pausing to understand why homemade bait persisted for so long. The answer is not merely tradition. It is economics. For much of American history, and particularly across the rural South and Midwest, purchasing manufactured fishing tackle was either impossible or unaffordable. In the early 1900s, a single commercially produced wooden lure could cost $1 or more, a significant sum when a day's labor might earn only twice that. The first major lure companies, Hedden, Pfluger, Shakespeare, Creek Chub, emerged between 1900 and 1920, but their products were marketed primarily to the gentleman angler, the sport fisherman with disposable income. For the families who fished to eat, who ran trot lines across the Tombigbee or set limb lines in the backwaters of the Arkansas River, manufactured tackle was an irrelevance. These families fished with what they had. Hooks were purchased. They were small, cheap, and difficult to forge at home, but nearly everything else was made or gathered. Lines were cut from cotton cord. Sinkers were poured from scrap lead. And bait was prepared from whatever the land and the kitchen provided. Chicken livers, beef blood, cheese, soap, crawfish, catalpa worms stripped from backyard trees, dough balls rolled on the porch. The tackle box, as a concept, did not exist. What existed was a coffee can, a jar of bait, and the knowledge of where the fish would be. Nowhere in America did homemade bait culture reach greater complexity than along the Mississippi River and its tributaries. The reason was simple: catfish. 3 species, blue, channel, and flathead, dominated the commercial and subsistence fisheries of the interior South, and each demanded specific approaches. For channel catfish, scent was everything. Families along the river developed their own proprietary stink baits, fermented mixtures left to ripen in the heat until they reached a potency that would gag the uninitiated but attract catfish from extraordinary distances. The base ingredients varied by region. In Mississippi, chicken blood and cheese were common. In Missouri, anglers favored dough baits made from flour and garlic, boiled into tough balls that could withstand current. In Arkansas, some fishermen swore by ivory soap, a tradition so persistent that a Mississippi State University study presented to the American Fisheries Society confirmed that soap-baited trotlines caught channel and blue catfish at rates statistically comparable to cut bait, while catching 0 endangered turtles. The flathead catfish demanded something different entirely. A predator that hunted like prey, the flathead would not touch fermented bait. For flatheads, the tradition was live bait, small bream, bullheads, or goldfish, often caught by the angler's children in farm ponds or creek backwaters before the trotline was set at dusk. This was family labor. Setting a 40-hook trotline across a river channel was not a one-person operation. It required a boat, a partner, hours of preparation, and the kind of intimate knowledge of current, depth, and bottom structure that could not be purchased at any price. The transmission of this knowledge followed predictable patterns. A boy learned from his father. A father had learned from his. The specific locations, The bend in the river where blue cats gathered below a winged dike, the deep scour hole downstream of a sandbar, were family knowledge, shared cautiously and protected fiercely. Commercial fishermen in particular guarded their methods. A trotline fisherman's bait recipe was not casual information. It was competitive advantage, refined over decades, and shared only within the tightest circles of trust. South of the river's main channel, in the labyrinthine bayous and cypress swamps of Louisiana, homemade bait culture took on a character all its own. Louisiana, the sportsman's paradise, has always been a place where fishing and eating are inseparable. The Appalachian Basin, the largest river swamp in the United States, sprawls across nearly 1 million acres of flooded timber, backwater channels, and slow-moving bayous where blue catfish exceeding 60 pounds and flatheads approaching 100 are not legend but documented fact. Here, the bait traditions were shaped by abundance and by Cajun and Creole culinary sensibility. Crawfish, which in Louisiana are as much a cultural institution as a food source, doubled as premier bait for virtually every freshwater species. Chicken liver cured in garlic and salt served double duty on the trotlines that Louisiana anglers strung across bayous and canals, some running more than 150 hooks. Shad, skipjack herring, and carp, oily fish with powerful set profiles, were cut into chunks and threaded onto circle hooks for blue catfish. The preparation was practical, but it was also deeply embedded in a foodways culture where the boundary between fishing and cooking had never been clearly drawn. Families in the bayou country often caught their bait before they caught their dinner. A cast net thrown into a canal at dawn might yield enough shad and minnows to bait 50 hooks. The bait itself cost nothing. The knowledge of where to throw that net, what time of year the shad schooled in which canal, which bait held up best in the warm summer water, that was the currency that mattered. 1,000 miles northeast, in the cold headwaters of the Appalachian Mountains, a quieter bait tradition persisted for generations. The southern Appalachians, from Virginia through the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Georgia, held a native brook trout, the only salmonid indigenous to the eastern United States. For the mountain families who depended on these fish, bait preparation was a matter of intimate ecological knowledge. Appalachian anglers gathered their bait from the stream itself and from the forest that fed it. Hellgrammites, the larvae of the Dobson fly, turned over from beneath flat rocks in the riffle, were prized as the most effective natural bait for both trout and smallmouth bass. Red worms dug from compost heaps and leaf mold. Catalpa worms, the caterpillars of the catalpa sphinx moth, stripped from the broad leaves of catalpa trees that families sometimes planted specifically for this purpose. In parts of western North Carolina, families maintained catalpa trees the way others kept kitchen gardens, as a reliable, renewable source of fishing bait. For those targeting catfish and panfish in the warmer valley rivers, dough baits were the standard. The formula was simple: flour, water, and whatever binding agent the family preferred, cornmeal, honey, cheese, or sugar. Some cooked the dough briefly to toughen it. Others added cotton fibers to help it hold the hook. These were not elaborate preparations, but they worked, and they cost essentially nothing, a critical advantage for families living in one of the most economically depressed regions of the country. The knowledge here was not written in recipe books. It was spoken, shared on front porches, passed along creek banks, demonstrated by example. A grandfather showed a grandchild where the Hellgrammites hid. A mother taught a daughter how to strip catalpa worms without killing the tree. The knowledge was ecological, practical, and deeply local. It could not be separated from the landscape that produced it. The transformation began in earnest at the turn of the 20th century, in a small town in Michigan. In the late 1890s, a beekeeper named James Hedden carved a piece of wood into the shape of a minnow, and used it to catch a bass. By 1901, Hedden and his son had founded a company and begun selling the first commercially produced wooden fishing lures in America. Within 2 decades, Hedden, Pfluger, Shakespeare, South Bend, and Creek Chub had established themselves as the foundations of a new industry. The artificial lure, carved from cedar, painted by hand, fitted with glass eyes and treble hooks, had arrived. But the rail revolution came later. After World War II, as the American economy boomed and leisure time expanded, sport fishing transformed from a niche pursuit into a mass-market industry. Monofilament line replaced braided cotton. Spinning reels made casting accessible to beginners. And soft plastic lures, developed from wartime polymer technology, flooded the market at prices that made them disposable. By the 1950s and 1960s, an angler could walk into a store and buy, for a few dollars, what previous generations had spent hours preparing by hand. The convenience was undeniable. The loss was subtler. When bait came from a package rather than a kitchen, something shifted in the relationship between angler and environment. The fisherman who prepared his own stink bait understood, at an instinctive level, the sensory world of the catfish. He knew that warm water dispersed scent faster than cold. He knew that blood-based preparations worked best in turbid water, while lighter baits performed in clearer conditions. He knew these things not because he had read them, but because he had observed them, across seasons, across years, across a lifetime spent on the same water. The manufactured bait industry did not merely replace a product. It replaced a process, and the knowledge embedded in that process. The trotline fisherman who mixed his own bait had to understand water temperature, current flow, species behavior, and seasonal patterns just to prepare for a night of fishing. The angler who bought a jar of commercial stink bait at a gas station needed to understand none of those things. The fish might still bite. But something in the chain of knowledge, the link between understanding the water and catching the fish, had been broken. This was not merely a southern phenomenon. Across rural America, the mid-20th century brought a wholesale transformation of the relationship between people and the natural resources around them. Families that had once grown their food, made their tools, and prepared their bait increasingly purchased all three. The self-sufficiency that had characterized American rural life for centuries gave way, gradually but irreversibly, to a consumer economy. And fishing, that most ancient of self-sufficient acts, was not immune. And yet, not everyone made the transition. In pockets across the South and Midwest, the old ways persisted, not as nostalgia, but as practice. Along the rivers of East Arkansas, veteran trotline fishermen still prepared their own cut bait from fresh-caught skipjack herring, preferring the oily, pungent flesh over anything sold in a store. In the bayous of South Louisiana, families still throw cast nets at dawn for shad, and still bait their limb lines with live bream pulled from backyard ponds. In the mountains of western North Carolina, a few old-timers still plant catalpa trees and still gather hellebromites from beneath the rocks of streams their grandfathers fished. These practitioners are not relics. They are repositories, living archives of knowledge that took generations to accumulate and that cannot be recovered once lost. Their methods are not quaint. They are precise, effective, and grounded in an understanding of aquatic ecology that most modern anglers have never been asked to develop. The conservation conversation in American fishing typically focuses on fish populations, water quality, and habitat preservation. These are essential concerns. But there is another form of conservation that receives far less attention: the preservation of traditional ecological knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how fish behave, how ecosystems function, and how human beings can interact with natural systems sustainably over long periods of time. The homemade bait traditions of the American South and Appalachia represent exactly this kind of knowledge. A trotline fisherman who knows which bend in the river holds catfish in July is not merely a skilled angler. He is an observer of hydrology, temperature, sediment, and species behavior, even if he has never used those words. A mountain angler who knows that hellgrammites disappear from a stream when water quality declines is performing biological monitoring, whether he thinks of it that way or not. This knowledge has economic value, ecological value, and cultural value. And it is disappearing at the rate of a generation. Today, approximately 58 million Americans fish recreationally each year, contributing billions of dollars to the national economy. The infrastructure that supports them, the tackle manufacturers, the guide services, the tournament circuits, the media platforms, is vast and sophisticated. But very little of that infrastructure is designed to preserve the older, quieter knowledge that predates it. The family stink bait recipe, the catalpa tree in the backyard, the cast net thrown at dawn in a Louisiana canal. These things exist outside the market economy. They cannot be bought, packaged, or sold. They can only be taught. And teaching requires the one thing that modern life makes most scarce: time spent together on the water without a purchase involved. There are signs of renewal. Across the country, a growing interest in traditional skills, heritage crafts, and self-sufficient practices has brought renewed attention to the older ways of doing things, including fishing. Small communities of anglers, many of them young, are rediscovering the satisfaction of preparing their own bait, carving their own lures, and fishing with methods their great-grandparents would have recognized. Online forums and social media channels now host discussions of dough bait recipes and stink bait formulas alongside the latest lure reviews. The knowledge, it turns out, is not entirely gone. It was waiting, in kitchens and barns, in the memories of old-timers willing to talk, in the waters themselves. The challenge is not to romanticize the past. The modern tackle industry has made fishing more accessible to more people than at any point in history, and that is an unambiguous good. The challenge is to recognize that accessibility and knowledge are not the same thing, that buying a lure is not the same as understanding a fish, and that the convenience of a tackle shop, for all its benefits, cannot replace what was learned across generations of direct, patient, hands-on engagement with the natural world. A kitchen table. A mason jar. The smell of garlic and rendered fat, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Somewhere in the Mississippi Delta, the old knowledge holds. The catfish are still there, patrolling the oxbow channels in the warm summer dark, following scent trails laid down by hands that learned this work the only way it can be learned, not from a shelf, but from a life lived close to the water. The jar is almost empty now, but the river remains. And somewhere, on a porch not far from the water's edge, someone is teaching a child how to mix the bait.